In the blistering heat of August 1885, a weary rancher named Elijah Grant stood at the edge of Riverbend's courthouse square, gripping a letter that could end everything he'd worked for. The ink was faded, but the message was clear. Final notice. Behind him, the crowd buzzed with the desperate chatter of men losing land, women clinging to dignity, and children too young to understand what poverty meant. Elijah didn't come to bid. He didn't come to rescue anyone. But when he locked eyes with a widow surrounded by 5 children, trembling but unbroken, something in him stirred. What happened next wouldn't just shake Riverbend to its core. It would change the meaning of family forever. Elijah Grant hadn't planned to speak a word that morning. He hadn't come to the courthouse square to make noise, only to observe what was left of a life he'd spent the last 3 years trying to hold together after Margaret's death. Her absence had hollowed out the ranch, the house, and the man himself. What had once been a home now felt like an obligation. The silence in the kitchen, the emptiness in their bed, and the daily grind of debt that kept the ranch on the edge of collapse, all of it wore him down to the bone. Still, he showed up, out of habit or maybe pride, to the auction held for people too unlucky or too late to save themselves. Riverbend was a small enough town that everyone eventually wound up at the same place, especially when pain and failure were being sold off to the highest bidder. Elijah stood on the outskirts of the crowd, boots dusty, hat pulled low, crumpled, mortgage notice in his pocket. He was preparing to say goodbye to his land, just as dozens of others had said goodbye to theirs. He'd been ignoring most of the bidding. Cows, wagons, fences. Men barked out prices and slapped each other on the backs like they were playing poker, not dismantling lives. Elijah's eyes drifted until they landed on something that didn't belong in that brutal procession of loss. A woman stood near the steps of the courthouse, her arms wrapped tightly around an infant. 4 children clustered around her, still and silent. The boys looked about 10, twins, perhaps, wearing threadbare shirts with the sleeves too short. One little girl stood behind the woman's skirt, only her golden curls visible, while the oldest child, a girl with a resolute face and worn boots, kept her shoulders squared as if ready to block the wind for the rest of them. Someone nearby whispered, "That's Clara Whitmore and her children. Husband died last winter, left him with nothing but debt." Elijah felt something stir in him that had been buried under grief. Not pity, but something closer to fury. They weren't supposed to be there. No family belonged in a place like this, paraded for judgment and sale. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip across the square. "Final item of the day, ladies and gentlemen. Due to unpaid debts owed to the Regional Land Trust by the late Mr. Whitmore, we are offering one labor-capable widow and her 5 children. Full household. Package. Starting bid, $50. A rustle passed through the crowd, unease spreading like a bad smell. Elijah's jaw tightened. He could barely believe what he was hearing. Clara's chin didn't drop, though. Her arms tightened around the baby and she looked straight ahead, unblinking. When a voice from the back called out, "50!" Elijah turned and saw Lyle Cunningham, a local cattleman known for treating workers worse than his horses. Clara flinched, not visibly, but in the way her teenage daughter shifted slightly closer to her, her stance defensive. Then came another bid. 65. That voice belonged to Arnold Greeley, a man with land and ambition but no decency to match. Elijah felt the weight of his wallet pressing against his thigh. $137. All he had left. Money meant to pay a sliver of his own mortgage. It wouldn't be enough to save his ranch. He already knew that. Still, his hand didn't rise, not yet. Clara hadn't cried. She hadn't pleaded or screamed. She stood like a stone pillar in a rising flood. The baby had begun to fuss, but the other children were quiet, too quiet for their age. The girl with the serious eyes whispered something to her mother, and Clara shook her head subtly. Another bid, 75, cut through the heat. Elijah glanced at the auctioneer, then back at the woman and her children. He thought of Margaret, how she would have walked straight into the fire to save a stranger. Margaret, who believed good people didn't look away, no matter how bad it hurt to look. The auctioneer raised his hand again. 75 going once. The words twisted in Elijah's gut. Going twice. And then, before his mind could stop his mouth, He heard his own voice. 100, he said, loud enough, loud, for the world to hear. A hush fell across the square. Eyes turned. Whispers began. Grant? Did he just bid? The auctioneer hesitated. $100, he repeated. Do I hear 110? Greeley looked annoyed but didn't speak. Cunningham smirked and offered 125. Elijah's stomach dropped. He had only $12 more left. He could walk away, no one would blame him. But when he met Clara's eyes, he saw no expectations, no gratitude, only fear carefully buried beneath resolve. He remembered the ache of empty rooms and the weight of silence that never let him sleep. Maybe this wasn't about saving someone else. Maybe it was about saving something in himself. Just as the auctioneer prepared to close, a voice cut through the crowd. Sam, called old Mr. Holloway the grocer. Take this, $20. The man pressed bills into Elijah's hand. Then another voice. And another. 10 more. I owe you anyway. It's yours, Grant. People who barely acknowledged Elijah's existence 2 days ago were now tossing their meager savings into his hands. Somehow, the total grew. 160, Elijah called, voice firm. The auctioneer blinked, stunned. Cunningham frowned, lips tight. The crowd murmured. Do I hear 170? No response. Going once. Clara held her breath. Going twice. The square stood frozen. Sold to Mr. Elijah Grant for $160. The hammer dropped. Cheers erupted. People clapped. Others remained silent, unsure what they had just witnessed. Elijah stood still as the reality hit him like a falling beam. He had just bought a family. Every coin in his pocket was gone, and now he was responsible for 6 strangers. Clara approached slowly. Mr. Grant, she said softly, I don't know what you expect from us, but I won't let my children grow up thinking they were saved as charity. We will earn our keep. Elijah tipped his hat, unsure how to answer. Then I guess we'll figure it out together, he said. And so, as the sun continued to bake the square, Elijah Grant, once just a man preparing to lose everything, found himself walking away not with land or cattle, but with the beginnings of a family. Clara Whitmore and her 5 children followed him to the wagon, silent but no longer alone. They didn't speak much as they rode out of Riverbend, dust rising behind the wheels. But even without words, something had shifted. The auction was over. What came next, neither of them knew, but Elijah couldn't help but wonder, had he saved them, or had they saved him? The wagon wheels groaned as Elijah Grant steered the family through the final stretch toward his ranch. The children sat quietly in the back, pressed together, saying little, but glancing nervously at the new world rolling out before them. Clara sat beside him, baby Caleb sleeping in her arms. She hadn't spoken since they left Riverbend, and Elijah didn't try to force conversation. Words felt like unnecessary luxuries when everything around them had been stripped to essentials: land, shelter, food, and the people you couldn't bear to lose. As they crested the hill, the house came into view, weathered, upright and a little crooked like the man who owned it. To Elijah, it had been a hollow echo chamber since Margaret's passing. To Clara and her children, it was simply unknown territory. He guided the horses down the slope and stopped near the porch. No one moved at first. Then Clara shifted and spoke softly. Children, this is home for now. Let's go see it. Her tone was even, not quite hopeful, not defeated either. Just steady. Inside, the house felt cramped despite its size. Elijah had never noticed how much space went unused until it was filled by tiny shoes. Hesitant, footsteps and the rustling of unfamiliar hands unpacking threadbare satchels. He gave Clara the master bedroom, without argument. She protested, but Elijah simply said, Margaret always said the lady of the house should sleep where the light comes through first. That seemed to quiet her. Annabelle, the eldest, took charge of settling the others. She moved through the rooms with a maturity that didn't belong to her age, directing Simon and Samuel to a small room near the back, and making sure Eliza stayed close. Elijah watched from the corner, trying to figure out where he belonged in his own home now that it no longer echoed with his loneliness. He said little, only offering help when absolutely needed, and spent most of the evening on the porch, staring out at the land as if it might offer answers. Clara moved with efficiency, like a woman used to doing more with less. She prepared a simple supper using whatever Elijah had in his pantry, which wasn't much. The children ate without complaint, eyes flickering toward their host but never lingering. The silence wasn't hostile, but thick with caution, as if both sides were trying not to make the wrong move. After dinner, Clara cleaned up, and Elijah found himself holding baby Caleb without quite knowing how it had happened. The infant settled into his arms as if it was the most natural thing in the world, which unnerved him far more than it should have. Later, when the children were tucked into bed and the lanterns dimmed, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, staring at his calloused hands. Then it happened. Faint at first, almost imagined. The sound of laughter. Children's laughter. Real, unguarded, bubbling laughter from one of the rooms. It sliced through the silence like a fresh breeze and knocked the air out of him. He hadn't heard that sound since Margaret had passed. He didn't realize how much he missed it until it returned. He didn't sleep much that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about what he'd done and whether it made any sense at all. He had brought strangers into his grief and handed them the keys to his broken life. But those weren't just strangers anymore. Clara had kept her dignity on that auction block, and her children had held themselves with a kind of discipline he hadn't expected. They weren't needy. They were just trying to survive. And now, in the taws, quiet spaces of his house, they were beginning to live again. The next morning, Elijah rose early and went to the barn, expecting to feed the animals alone. Instead, he found Clara already there, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, checking feed levels and examining the condition of the fencing. She greeted him without surprise. "The fencing on the east side is sagging. You'll lose cattle if the wind picks up," she said, brushing hay from her hands. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "You know ranching?" "I know order," she replied. "Whether it's a classroom, a home, or a farm, things need to make sense, or they fall apart." He followed her back to the house where she pulled out a notebook and began drawing rough diagrams of the ranch. "You're feeding too much grain to the wrong cattle," she said, flipping pages with confidence. "The milkers don't need it, but your bulls do. Your hens aren't laying, because the coop's too dark, and I saw at least 5 rows in the vegetable patch that should have been turned over 2 weeks ago." Elijah stared at her, part offended, part fascinated. "You've been here one night." "I've had eyes longer than that," she replied. "If I'm going to stay here with my children, I'm not going to sit idle. This place can run better, and if you want to keep it, you're going to need a plan, not just sweat and good intentions." Elijah wanted to argue, but deep down he knew she was right. Her words weren't condescending, just blunt. Margaret had been like that too. It was the first time since her death that someone had spoken to him, like he was still a man with potential, not just one clinging to ruins. By nightfall, the house was still. The children had found places to sleep, and Clara had convinced Elijah to reorganize the pantry. He hadn't agreed with all her suggestions, but he'd gone along anyway. Something about her made the silence less heavy. Sitting on the porch after supper, he found himself listening again for that sound, the laughter, and it came, not just from the children this time, but from Clara, soft and fleeting as she soothed Caleb to sleep. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it changed something in the air. Elijah leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. The house that had once felt like a tomb now felt different. Still quiet, yes, but no longer dead. A house full of silences had become, somehow, a house full of possibility. And as he opened his eyes, listening to that laughter behind the walls, he realized he didn't feel alone anymore. Victor Callahan's name was enough to quiet a room, and Elijah Grant knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. It didn't take long for word of the auction to spread across Riverbend, and when Callahan realized he'd been publicly outbid, his pride took a blow it couldn't tolerate. Elijah received the first sign 2 days later, a messenger on horseback, carrying a letter with no signature but written in a hand Elijah had seen on cattle contracts. It was a short note, precise, arrogant, and insulting. Callahan offered $200 in cash to correct the outcome of an unfortunate Spectacle. The message was clear. Sell Clara and the children as if they were a transaction. Undo the damage to Callahan's reputation and walk away richer than Elijah had ever been in his life. Elijah didn't hesitate. He burned the letter in the stove without reading it aloud. When Clara noticed the ashes the next morning, she didn't ask what it had been. She just said, "I'm glad you didn't answer. Some men deserve silence." But Callahan wasn't the kind of man who accepted silence as a response. The next week, a stranger showed up on the edge of the Grant Ranch. He didn't say much, just rode the perimeter, stared too long at the house, and left. Then came the night when the chicken coop was slashed open and half the flock ran off into the hills. Elijah found the mess at dawn and knew immediately it hadn't been an animal. A week later, someone cut the fence along the western pasture. Then one of the cows turned up dead, poisoned by the look of it. Clara remained composed, though her eyes darkened. "He's escalating," she said one night after supper. "He's seeing how far he can push before we break." Elijah nodded. "Then we show him we don't." The final blow came on a dry Friday night. Elijah had just drifted into sleep when a strange flicker outside his window snapped him awake. He bolted upright and ran to the front door, his breath catching as he saw it. The barn was on fire. Flames climbed greedily into the sky, and the dry wood burned like kindling. Clara was already on her feet, pulling the children from their beds, shouting for them to head toward the creek. Elijah didn't wait for help. He ran straight for the well, filled 2 buckets, and sprinted back, dousing what he could. But it was no use. The structure groaned and cracked, collapsing in on itself. All the winter feed, tools, and some of the livestock supplies, gone in minutes. He kept fighting the blaze until the last ember hissed. His hands blistered, lungs burning, heart hollowed out. When he turned, Clara stood behind him, holding Caleb, the other children huddled together behind her, their eyes wide and silent. No one cried. The fire had stolen even that. The next morning neighbors came, but not many. A few passed by on wagons, slowing enough to look but not enough to stop. Doc Hemsworth offered bandages for Elijah's hands. Mrs. Dotson sent some bread with her oldest boy, but didn't step inside the fence line. The unspoken message was clear. Callahan's reach scared them. Elijah didn't blame them. They had families too. Still, the isolation stung. That afternoon, as he sat on the porch, knees aching and soul more tired than ever, Clara brought him coffee and a folded piece of paper. "This is a plan," she said. "A way to rebuild the barn and stretch what's left of the cattle operation. If you're still with me." Elijah took the paper, hands trembling not from burns, but from something deeper. "I never stopped being with you," he said. Clara didn't smile, but her shoulders eased. "Then let's get to work." 2 days later, the tide began to turn. First, it was Tom Barrett, a quiet man who ran the grain mill. He showed up with a wagon full of reclaimed lumber, said nothing, just unloaded it and nodded before riding off. Then came the Parkers with nails and rope. Doc Hemsworth returned, this time with his teenage son and 2 hammers. Within a week, half the town had trickled in. No speeches, no apologies for their delay, just quiet labor. They saw the family hadn't broken. They'd seen fire, fear, and cruelty, and were still standing. Annabelle helped mix mortar. Simon and Samuel carried tools. Eliza collected kindling and water. Even little Caleb, strapped to Clara's back, babbled contentedly as his mother directed the work like she'd been born to do it. Elijah watched them, stunned by how this makeshift family had become a force stronger than any threat Victor Callahan could throw at them. By the end of the second week, a new barn stood where the ashes had cooled. Simpler, smaller, but solid, built by hands that had chosen courage over fear. Elijah stood beside Clara in the fading afternoon light, watching Simon and Samuel chase each other across the yard, Eliza clapping and laughing beside them. Clara held Caleb close, her expression unreadable. "He's not done," she said quietly. "Callahan will come back. Men like him always do." Elijah nodded, resting a hand on the new wooden beam. "Then let him come," he replied. "We'll be ready." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the Grant Ranch, scarred but unshaken, stood as proof that even in the face of fire, some things don't burn. Clara had carried the truth for weeks, unsure of whether the right moment would ever come. But after the fire and the quiet wave of community support that followed, she understood something had shifted, not just in Riverbend, but in Elijah himself. He had stood with her when others stepped away. He hadn't flinched when Victor Callahan made his threats, nor when their world turned to ash. That kind of loyalty earned more than gratitude. It earned trust. So, after the new barn was up, after the children had settled into a routine that felt less like survival and more like life, she asked Elijah to meet her at the kitchen table after supper. She brought with her a small, weathered lockbox, the kind her late husband had kept hidden beneath a false floorboard in the cabin they once called home. "What's this?" Elijah asked, eyes narrowing slightly. "The reason Callahan wants us gone," she said, lifting the lid. Inside were dozens of folded letters, land contracts and accounting ledgers, all written in her husband's meticulous hand. Names, dates, parcel numbers. Clara explained how Thomas, a meticulous record keeper and former accountant before ranching, had started noticing irregularities. He didn't mean to get involved, she said, but once he saw how Callahan manipulated property deeds and falsified cattle brands, he couldn't unsee it. Her husband had planned to go public, even gathered signatures from other small ranchers who'd been swindled. But then he fell. He made Clara promise she would keep the records safe just in case. Elijah thumbed through a few pages, his brow tightening as the implications became clear. "This is enough to destroy him," he muttered. Clara nodded. "And maybe enough to buy us time." They brought the documents to the Riverbend First Bank the next morning. The banker, Mr. Holloway, was a careful man who rarely deviated from procedure, but even he couldn't ignore the gravity of what Elijah placed on his desk. Elijah explained their situation plainly: the damage to the ranch, the rebuilding efforts, the tight timeline of the mortgage deadline. Then Clara spoke, calm and direct. She laid out the history behind the documents, never claiming innocence, never begging. Just facts. The room went silent. Holloway tapped his pen against his ledger, weighing risk against opportunity. "And what would you like from the bank?" he finally asked. "An extension," Elijah replied. 6 months. We'll show you this ranch can be profitable again." Holloway looked between them, then back at the evidence. "You're offering this to me as collateral?" Clara smiled thinly. "No, we're offering it as insurance. Against Callahan's influence." There was a pause, then the banker nodded slowly. "You'll have your extension, and I'll pretend I never saw these." As the days passed, the mood on the ranch shifted. The children became more relaxed, less watchful. Simon and Samuel ran ahead of Elijah during chores, racing to fetch tools or water, eager to be useful. Eliza followed Clara around with a basket, collecting eggs and asking endless questions about plants and animals. Annabelle, the oldest, took to writing down the day's tasks in a small ledger, mimicking her mother's efficiency. Baby Caleb, now crawling everywhere, seemed to understand instinctively where everyone was, always gravitating toward Elijah's boots. The routine they established didn't feel forced. It felt earned. One afternoon, as Elijah was repairing the barn gate, Simon ran up to him with a hammer in hand. "Papa, you forgot this," he shouted. The word hit Elijah like a gunshot, not in pain, but in astonishment. He looked at the boy, then at Clara, who was watching from the porch. She said nothing, only nodded as if to say, "You've become what they needed." What surprised Elijah most wasn't how quickly the children had accepted him, but how naturally it felt to accept them back. There was no ceremony, no declaration, just a new understanding, woven slowly into the fabric of their days. He found himself checking on them at night, making sure they were warm. He started teaching the boys how to fix saddles and clean rifles. He even sat with Annabelle one evening as she tried to write her first letter to a cousin she hadn't seen in years. "Should I call you father in it?" she asked, and Elijah, stunned, simply replied, "If that's what you feel, then yes." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Clara joined him on the porch. "I didn't ask them to call you that," she said softly. I know, Elijah answered, watching the stars. And that's why it means everything. The community's attitude changed too. It was slow at first. A nod here, a wave there. But over time, Clara's quiet competence and the children's warmth wore down old suspicions. At the general store, people now asked her opinion on planting seasons. At church, Eliza sat with the pastor's daughter during Sunday school. And more than once, someone stopped Elijah in town to ask if Clara might help organize a budget or keep books. Word traveled. The Grant Ranch was no longer a solitary man's dying hope. It had become a working, living household, held together by purpose, not pity. And though Callahan's shadow still lingered, it no longer loomed quite so large. There was strength in alliances and protection in secrets. By the time fall came whispering through Riverbend, the Grant Ranch stood steadier than it had in years. The barn was whole, the house no longer echoed. And Elijah, once a man drifting through days he couldn't feel, now stood with a purpose he didn't know he needed. As he watched Simon and Samuel chase each other through the pasture, their laughter rising into the golden afternoon, he felt Clara step beside him. "It's different now," she said quietly. "Yes," Elijah replied, resting a hand gently on her back. "And for the first time, I'm glad it is." Behind them, from the front porch, Eliza called out cheerfully, "Papa, Mama, come see what Caleb did." Clara smiled. "They've chosen," she whispered. Elijah nodded. "So have I." The first shot rang out just after midnight. Elijah bolted upright in bed, his heart thudding with an instinctive understanding that this wasn't a warning. It was war. He grabbed his rifle without hesitation and rushed to the front window. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness beyond the barn, and flames began to spread along the outer fencing. In the distance, he could make out silhouettes on horseback, men circling, moving with calculated malice. "Clara!" he shouted as he threw open the bedroom door. She was already awake, clutching Caleb to her chest and ushering the other children toward the root cellar. "Keep low," she ordered, her voice sharp but steady. The twins obeyed instantly, grabbing Eliza's hand while Annabelle helped pry open the trap door. Elijah watched for a moment, then turned and moved out into the yard, gun ready. This was no longer about property or pride. Callahan had brought violence to their home, and Elijah would not let him walk away from it unchallenged. He moved through the shadows, using the terrain to his advantage, crouching behind the shed as more bullets ripped through the night. He returned fire, careful and deliberate, hitting the wheel of a wagon he knew would block the gate. Sparks crackled in the distance as the barn caught flame again, rebuilt with sweat and community hands, now reduced to kindling for Callahan's revenge. Clara appeared behind him briefly, ducking behind a trough with her shotgun. "The kids are safe," she said breathlessly. "I'm staying with you." He opened his mouth to protest, but she was already firing. The determination in her face gave him the strength he didn't know he'd lost. "They're not getting through that door," she muttered, reloading without fear. Elijah gave a grim nod. "Not while we're breathing." Chaos stretched into what felt like an eternity. Horses screamed, shots echoed, and smoke choked the sky. Just when Elijah feared the tide was turning against them, the sound of additional hooves thundered from the eastern ridge. Lanterns flickered, followed by the unmistakable voice of Sheriff James Radley. "Drop your weapons, this ends now." Dozens of armed riders followed him, townsfolk Elijah hadn't expected to stand up, but who had clearly made their choice. A few of Callahan's men tried to flee, only to be tackled off their mounts. Others panicked and surrendered. Within minutes, the battle was over. Elijah stood stunned, gun still raised, until Radley put a hand on his shoulder. "We heard the shots," the sheriff said. "You held them off until we got here. Damn brave, Grant." Clara emerged from the porch, Caleb still clutched to her chest, her eyes scanning for the children. When she saw them safe, her legs gave out, and she collapsed to her knees. Elijah ran to her, wrapping an arm around her shaking shoulders. Morning revealed the full damage. The barn, again, was a black skeleton. Several of the fences were scorched, and a few animals had fled or been wounded. But no one from the Grant family, no child, no neighbor, no soul on their side, had fallen. Clara moved like a commander that morning, tending to the children's wounds, helping Radley collect names of the attackers. Annabelle brought out the lockbox with the documents, placing it in the sheriff's hands. With silent finality, "Everything is here," she said. "Land thefts, cattle markings, threats, even names." Radley took the papers, flipping through them with widening eyes. "This is enough," he said firmly. "Enough to bury him." Witnesses stepped forward. Tom Barrett, the Parkers, even Mrs. Dotson. Their testimonies weaving the final net around Callahan's name. By noon, a formal warrant had been issued. But Callahan, ever the predator, was already gone. Word spread he'd crossed the state line by dawn, abandoning his men and leaving behind the ashes of his own empire. Elijah stood by the road, rifle still in hand, watching the horizon with hollow eyes. "He ran," Clara said softly behind him, "because he knows he lost." Elijah nodded but didn't speak. The anger hadn't vanished, only buried under exhaustion. Behind them, neighbors were already picking up the scattered tools, organizing repairs. James Radley walked up, nodding toward the wreckage. "We'll rebuild again," he said, but this time, without fear. Elijah finally turned to Clara, then to the children emerging cautiously from the house. Eliza ran into his arms, and for the first time that day, he let himself smile. That evening, as the family sat together on the porch, bruised, bloodied, but alive, Clara rested her head against Elijah's shoulder. "He thought he could break us," she murmured, "but all he did was prove we were worth fighting for." Elijah looked at the children chasing fireflies near the well, at the scorch marks across the field, and the people who stayed even after the smoke cleared. "Let him run," Elijah said. "This family's not going anywhere." And with the warrant signed and Callahan on the run, the night of fire and fury had ended. Not in defeat, but in a promise that they would never be victims again. The morning of the wedding came without tension, without fear. For the first time in months, Elijah Grant awoke not to fire or gunshots, but to the muffled sound of children laughing and Clara's voice humming low from the kitchen. Riverbend had changed. The land felt stronger, not because of the grass or the rebuilt barn, but because the people now stood with him, with them. With Callahan gone, the shadow that had haunted every fence post and darkened every path was finally lifted. Elijah had once believed survival was all he could hope for, but now, as he buttoned his shirt and stared at his reflection, he realized something deeper had taken root: peace. The ranch wasn't just functional, it was thriving. Thanks to Clara's record-keeping, her strategy, and a partnership with neighboring ranchers, they'd secured a contract with the Western Line Railroad. For the first time since Margaret's passing, the books were balanced, the debts nearly paid, and the future no longer seemed like a gamble. The ceremony was held in the small white church on Main Street, the same place Elijah had once stood alone in the back pew, unsure of whether he belonged anywhere. Now the place was the place, packed. Friends, neighbors, even those who had once been silent bystanders during Callahan's reign, all showed up. Clara stood at the front wearing a simple cream dress, altered from one of Margaret's old gowns. Annabelle had stitched the final touches herself. Simon and Samuel served as ring bearers, proudly guarding the box like it was gold. Eliza scattered wildflowers with exaggerated seriousness, while baby Caleb, perched in Doc Hemsworth's arms, gurgled as if offering his own approval. Elijah couldn't take his eyes off Clara. Her strength, her fire, her loyalty, all of it carved into her every step. When the Reverend finally asked, "Do you, Elijah Grant, take Clara Whitmore?" he didn't just say yes. He said, "I already have." After the service, no one rushed home. The entire town stayed to eat, to dance, to toast what they now considered their own triumph. Pete Jenkins raised a glass and shouted, "Here's to the woman who outsmarted a land baron, and the man who gave her the keys to his soul." The room erupted in cheers. Even Mrs. Dotson, once the most reserved of critics, baked an apple pie for the occasion. What had begun as reluctant support had become full acceptance. Clara no longer had to prove herself. She'd done that with every long day of rebuilding, every honest word in the ledgers, every step she'd taken to hold her family together. Elijah stood beside her, his hand never leaving hers, realizing that the family he'd thought was gone forever had simply taken a new shape. He wasn't filling a void, he was building something new. Later, as the crowd thinned and the sun began to dip behind the hills, Elijah and Clara returned to the ranch. The children ran ahead, now so familiar with the land that it no longer seemed foreign to them. Simon and Samuel chased each other to the water trough. Eliza held Annabelle's hand and talked about the flowers she wanted to plant around the barn. Caleb, finally tired, dozed on Elijah's shoulder. The two adults walked slowly, taking it all in. The fence lines had been repaired. The coop was fuller than ever. The barn stood tall. Again. It was not perfect, but it was honest, earned. Rebuilt from ashes by hands that refused to surrender. They paused near the porch, watching the golden light wash over the fields. Clara looked around, and then leaned gently against Elijah's side. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just the wedding, all of it, the ranch, the safety, the children's laughter." Elijah nodded, still watching the horizon. "You saved this place, Clara." But she shook her head and turned toward him. "No," she said, "we saved each other." He looked down at her, touched by the truth of it. They had both come into this broken, one with a shattered past, the other with a heavy future. But together, they had rebuilt not just land, but trust, purpose, and love. They walked again, arm in arm, across the porch and into the twilight. The children's voices echoed in the distance as the wind swept over the land that no longer felt like a battlefield. Clara glanced at Elijah with a quiet smile. "We saved each other," she repeated, "and we're going to keep doing that, every single day." Elijah returned the smile and kissed her forehead. "Yes, Clara, every single day." And as the door closed behind them, the Grant family, whole, proud, and unafraid, stepped into their new life, bound not by blood, but by a vow stronger than any made in church, the promise to never let go. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Souls of the Old West for more powerful tales just like this one. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and send this video to someone who would love to experience this journey too. Thank you for riding with us.